Hi everybody, I'm Janine Oakman. I'm the Associate Director of Education here at the Contemporary Jewish Museum. And I'm thrilled to be up here with both of you. And I just want to tell you that I thoroughly enjoyed both of these books. They were both those page turners that I was sitting up late at night finishing. So just really, it's a thrill. And Andy, he goes by Andy. I've been told I can call him Andy. Andy, something you said up there really struck me, this idea of everyday magic. And that is one of the through lines in both of your books, and I've been thinking since I read them simultaneously about the similarities. So I want to think about that for a second. The other thing I've been thinking about is I recently heard a review of the book by Jill Lepore about Jane Franklin, and the reviewer said it defies traditional genres. It's not exactly a biography, it's not exactly historical fiction, and this element of magic in both of your books, which are partially realistic fiction, partially the supernatural, the fantastical, is pretty unusual. So I'd like to hear a bit about your choice to write in this mode, and when you decided to move from the history or the reality into that realm of magic.
Well, we were just talking beforehand. Helena and I have met once before, but we haven't been on a stage together, which is a different kind of relationship. And we were talking about books we read when we were much younger, and how she was saying she didn't read the girl books. She read Robert Heinlein and Bradbury.
Yeah, and the Star Trek books and Doctor Who and Stephen King and all that stuff.
Well, that's what I was reading too, and the girl books, probably. But it means that, because there wasn't. YA wasn't really around for me, so I went from children's literature. My middle ground was science fiction, fantasy, and when you're reading at 12 to 15, it stamps you.
Right, and that when I my first favorite book when I was probably when is it that you learn to read? 5 or 6 years old, was this book of. It was called Myths and Enchantment Tales, and it was Greek and Roman myths that had been sort of bowdlerized and made appropriate for children, and put into this really beautiful volume with all these Art Deco illustrations. And I read that book over and over and over and over again, and I feel like something must have sort of gotten imprinted in terms of structure, in terms of this is what story is it falls along this sort of fantastical lines, and that just sort of pointed me forward at that point.
I had D'Aulaire's book of Greek myths, which was, I was obsessed with that. I see you, your Greek myths, and I up you, Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh. I wasn't in a campaign until college.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Similarities. I guess the question is, how does that lead to literature?
Yeah, I read an interview with you where you had said that a friend encouraged you when you were in early stages of your novel to be a little bit more imaginative or to move into the realm of fantasy.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk about how those childhood, those formative books impacted how you crafted this novel.
Well, yeah, and that is actually a really funny story, because looking back on it, I'm like, what was I thinking? Because I was writing these stories that were about my family, my husband's family, and I'm Jewish and he's Arab American. That's sort of, and we share this family history around coming to America and immigration and that sort of thing. But they were these really realist, sort of in the Raymond Carver vein sort of stories, and they just fell flat. They were not doing anything at all for anyone. And I was complaining about it to a friend of mine in the workshop, and she said, "You're such a nerd. You read all of this science fiction and fantasy and stuff. That's what you're always talking about in class. Why aren't you writing like that?" And it was bing, it just hadn't occurred to me. And that was when that sort of, when that crossover happened. And that was also when, I had Neil Gaiman, Sandman and American Gods and all that sort of, especially American Gods around, the people bringing their gods to America and their pantheon with them, and that pantheon sort of taking on life and having to sustain itself in America. And, Michael Chabon, you guys know how to pronounce his last name better than I do, I'm sure. Chabon, okay. And, Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which was pretty much the formative book of my 20s, and looking back on it, like the book that started me down the path of deciding I wanted to go back and really write. And so I had so many models. And I read, it's funny, I read an interview with Benjamin Percy recently. He wrote Red Moon, which is a sort of a novel about, well, it's about werewolves, but it's more sort of a metaphor for like the American police state and the war on terrorism. And someone asked him about, you know, the trend of the supernatural in fiction. And he's like, no, realism is the trend. This, you know, it's only been this century that people have really expected stories to be about things that have actually happened. Going back, it's, you know, that in human history, this is the norm. And that sort of, it was sort of heartening. It was like, yeah, you tell them, and that's, I think, sort of always where, I don't know if that answered your question in the least, but now it's your turn.
That's the same answer. Well, I mean, because I think, right, it's always been this way. You know, Virginia Woolf wrote a novel about a person who changed genders every 15 years or so, which sounds like a Star Trek episode or something like it. There's a species that does that.
Right, yeah.
Right, you know.
I remember the episode you're talking about.
Yeah, yes, you do that, right? Every life, I guess. But, you know, and Invisible Man and the portrait of Dorian Gray. I mean, these are the top of literature, and they're all writing out of fantasy because that's the storytelling tradition we really have. Because why do we like fiction instead of nonfiction? Because we get in the realm of metaphor, and we can, for a moment, think we're not talking about what we're actually talking about. And so, like, you watch an episode of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and there's like a girl whose boyfriend is sort of a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, and she's afraid of when he turns. And we know we're talking about bad relationships, but we get to pretend we're talking about monsters, and we get to have both, like a crazy plot with monsters, but then talk about relationships. It's a way to get at it without realism. And so you're right. If you're stuck with realism, it's sort of, it seems like it's only about that case.
Right.
And if you write about something a little magical, it seems like it's about everyone.
Yeah, and in the Twilight Zone, all the stuff that Serling could get away with in the 50s, talking about politics that no one else could get away with, because he wasn't talking about politics, he was talking about aliens. And, you know, and so he just sort of sidestepped all of that, but everyone knew what he meant. And, yeah.
But now don't ask us what we're really talking about.
I also heard an interview with Helene where you said no book is sort of deader in the water than one with an obvious message. So I won't ask you to share your obvious messages.
Well, because I wonder it was the same for you, because I knew early on what I kind of wanted to approach, but then you know that, but I didn't write the book thinking about that. I wrote, oh, what happens next? How does she, you know, you think about the plot because you've already inserted the secret idea in your head.
Right, right, and you just sort of keep it in the back brain and trust that it'll come out onto the page when it needs to. But if you start with, like, you know, and the moral of the story is, then that's just, you know, who wants to read that?
Well, they will be swept away. And I have students sometimes who ask me about politics, and do writers have a duty, if we're strongly political, I'm super left-wing, to write for that purpose? And I'm like, if you really believe it, then you will live it through more honestly by letting your characters do what they feel they should do.
Right, especially since, like, to me, good literature is is literature that asks questions, and it makes the reader ask questions and gives perspectives and transports you into someone else's head. And if that person's head is just yourself yelling political things, that's just not going to be happy for anyone.
Did your characters ever do anything that you kind of didn't like?
That I didn't like?
Well, that you were like, oh, I had hoped they would be more socialist, you know? Or,
you know, I don't know. It was hard. It was sort of, I think the Golem, I had to sort of decide sometimes. She is so impressionable as part of her character, is that she sort of takes in the fears and desires of everyone around her. So she's very malleable. And was hard to sort of give her a spine at the same time. And I didn't want her to be sort of like, you know, blown around in the wind, believing this or that or the other thing. And, you know, there's so much of like the budding socialism movement that was happening in New York at the time. And, you know, I've got one character who's, you know, a very political person, but he's got a lot of doubts at the same time. And that, to me, was what made him interesting. So I'm sidestepping your question. Did anyone do something I didn't like? I think maybe, but it was more like, I don't want you to do that because it doesn't make sense for where I wanted to take the book, but no, really, that's the thing that you are going to do, aren't you? Darn it. So that more than any sort of political thing, I think. Yeah.
And what about the same question
Yeah.
for you?
Well, it was actually the first time way you answered it made a lot of sense to me because, you know, I chose to write in the voice of a female character, and I'm like, I hope this comes across feminist, you know, like, I hope that she doesn't seem like she travels to these different versions of her life in different time periods. I'm like, I hope the 40s one, because she has a moment where she's like, she was an ERA bra-burning 80s woman, and in the 40s she's like a mom cooking, and she's like, I don't know, I kind of like it.
Yep.
And like, I don't think my mom would have said that. But I thought to myself, I just have to do this character. That is my job.
Exactly. It's like, I think that is sort of going back to my fears for the poem is like, we all feel this responsibility to write strong female characters, but how do we keep that from becoming two-dimensional? And how do we keep that from, you know, you can make them like too confident and raw, and then it's not as interesting anymore. So yeah, I think you did fine.
Okay. Yes.
You know, one of the things that struck me is a theme that is related to the women characters, but also related to sort of the supernatural characters in your book, Colleen, is the tension between being bound for Greta and also for her brother. It's being bound by the structures of the various eras she travels between as a woman, but also for Felix as a gay man. And then for a golem is meant to be bound to a master, yet you find out, I'm not spoiling anything, hopefully, very quickly, that she is in New York without a master, and the genie finds himself trapped in human form. So there's this tension between sort of your obligation, whether that's as a female or a golem, and freedom. And I think there's a gender dynamic too, but wondering if you could talk a little bit about that in both books.
You're looking at me?
Well, I mean, the experiment of the book for me was to wonder how a woman's life, if everything else is the same, had the same husband and family, but just the year was different, how the limitations of the era in which she lived would utterly change her life. And I've got 1918, 1941, and 1985, and it didn't seem to me a straight line of progress, particularly. That's what intrigued me. And then also, her brother is a gay man, because I'm a gay man, so I was interested in how men with a lot of privilege would function in those different times. And so I did a lot of research, but it was mostly about that's what bound them, was that time. And I think it came from having grandmothers and even my mom that I sometimes thought, like, here's a brilliant woman born in the wrong time. How frustrating that must have been for both of my grandmothers to have been so much smarter than their husbands, but have been born poor in the rural South with nothing to do but write letters to the president, you know. And all they could do was raise their children to have, and for my mother's mother to raise her daughters to have a better chance and not make those mistakes. But how terrible, because it was just the time she was born in that stopped her.
For me, I think it came it came about in an interesting sort of roundabout fashion, which was from the structure of the book. It was that I had to figure out a way to keep them in New York. and keep them from being too powerful. Because it's sort of like, you know, the genie, something's got to keep him there. You know, he's this creature who, you know, in his like natural form could just, you know, basically fly away. So what's keeping him in New York? Why does he have to sort of make relationships with people around him? And so I came up with this idea of having him bound and sort of trapped. And then for the golem, it was similar, because it was like, what's, you know, sort of the idea of the golem and the master sort of came with the territory, that every golem has a master, and I sort of took her master away because that would, you know, free her up as a character to explore her surroundings and have some agency. But then it was like, okay, here's this thing that's missing in her life, and that's got to be very hard for her. That's the only way she knew how to function. And now here she is sort of being ruled just a little bit by everyone around her. So it just sort of presented itself to me as the two of them existing on these ends of the spectrum, that she was very, very, you know, made to be a servant. And he was sort of the essence of a free spirit. And now their circumstances have sort of forced them to the middle of the spectrum. But they came at it with such different baggage. And as soon as I realized that that could be like an interesting interplay between them, I sort of pumped it up, because I was like, okay, let's like really look at this. And that led to some really interesting arguments between them. And it just became more of an interesting idea to me, sort of the tension between duty and self-determination. Because it was such a facet, and still is, of sort of the American immigrant experience. And, you know, what do we, you know, what do we bring, what traditions do we bring, what traditions do we hold on to? What do we sort of either put aside or jettison in favor of new ideas that we like better? And of course, all the guilt goes like that. You know, we are in the Jewish Museum, the word guilt has to come up. So yeah, that was how it came about for me.
Great, and I'm so glad you brought up being in a Jewish museum, because we're going to get to that in a second. But I want to talk about something that's almost Jewish, which is New York City. Almost, it's Jewish, right? So we were talking before we got started about, we've all spent time in New York, and both books are set in New York. And in fact, I think your characters might have even walked down the same street.
Exactly.
I was noticing that, yeah.
And there's something that's really, we were talking before, there's something that's really compelling about New York. So I wanted to hear a little bit about what drew you both to New York as a setting for your books, and a little bit about how you did your research.
Were you still in New York when you wrote this?
When I started it.
Started it.
Yeah.
Me too. I had lived in New York 3 times. I lived there right after college in 1992 to 93, and I failed completely. I lived in the West Village when it was still affordable, and my friends kept saying, Andy, you need an edge. You don't have an edge. And I'm like, I don't know what that is. You're hurting me with words. And so I left. I went to Montana. I couldn't hack it. And Montana, says the audience. Yeah. And then I went back. I was like, all right, I'm going to win it. And I went in 2005, and I taught for a semester at Hunter College. And I lived in the East Village. And I was super lonely. And I couldn't hack it. Again. So I moved back. And then I went back in 2009. I got a fellowship from the New York Public Library. They have this thing where they give you an office in the library, the one with the lions out front, and they give you like an assistant, and they send the dumbwaiter, the pneumatic tube system down to get books up, and I had that for 9 months, and they give you money to live in New York City. They do. They do. And so, by that time, I married the man I met in Montana, who had never lived in a big city, lived in San Francisco, but not like New York. So I was like, all right, let's see if you really like it. I was like, he'll never be able to hack it, like me. So I was like, all right, I got a place in the West Village, and he loved it. He had no problem. No problem. He was an instant New Yorker. I was just so frustrated. But I had written, all my other books were in San Francisco, and I had decided to set this book, basically because there I was in the New York Public Library with incredible access. But you were already there.
Yeah. And, oh God, it's funny because I had sort of the opposite spousal experience, which was when I got into Columbia, I proposed to my boyfriend, and we moved to New York, and he knew pretty much from going that he wasn't going to like it, but he really did not like it, and that was why we only lived there for the 2 years that I was in grad school. He was finishing his PhD at the time, and from a distance he was getting a PhD at University of Washington, so like he's being on the other side of the country from his research group, and like it was right working on his PhD, going to karate class, getting groceries. That was his life, and so it was. We left New York for the sake of the marriage, basically.
That lonely thing that I felt probably in 2005.
Yes,
Because
yes.
New Yorkers, because I found that New Yorkers, they'll be like, great, you're in town. They will never invite you to anything. Because they're busy, you're not in their minds.
Well, and I had sort of the
Related to
built-in
them.
social world of Columbia because
Yes.
I was a grad student, and it was like, yes, let's come to another author party, sweetie, like physicist in a room full of writers, all going, oh wow, you think about science, and asking like weird Zen and the art of neutrino sort of questions, and But going back to like the question of why the book in New York, I think, it probably came more easily to mind because I was there at the time, but when the idea sort of came to me, it was like, okay, Golem and Ajiti, where are these two going to meet? The only place they're going to meet is New York.
Yeah.
That's like, and at the turn of the century, sort of in the crush of, the heyday of immigration. From both Eastern Europe and from Syria. That just sort of presented it to me as like, okay, if these two can bump into each other, if it's going to be like any, corner in the world, it's going to be somewhere in New York. So that was sort of how it happened.
Great. Can we get to the Jewish question now? I have to ask it. We're here. So we know that you're from a Jewish family and your husband's from an Arab American family, and just want to know more about, in the process of writing this book, what discoveries did you make about perhaps your own culture or about his cultural heritage? It's a big question.
I made a lot of discoveries about my own heritage. I grew up Reform Jewish in suburban Chicago, and that was very much a, we are modern American Jews, and I say, I sound like I'm saying bad things about it, but it's sort of like, kicking your brother, I guess. I really, it formed a lot of my identity, but it was very concentrated on sort of like the Jewish life cycle and learning your Torah portion and becoming a Jewish American, and not so much about, no one talked about God, no one talked about spirituality or Kabbalah or any of that sort of stuff. And so when I started to get into the research, I just, all of that was new to me. All of that sort of, and we didn't really learn the folk stories. We were too busy learning about, the history of Jews in America and the creation of Israel and that sort of stuff that there was really no Isaac Bashevis Singer, there was no any of that. My grandparents didn't tell me those stories either. So when I started researching all the Golem stories, most of those were new to me. And it really was, and especially doing a lot of reading about Orthodox Judaism for a couple of characters, I felt like a completely different religion in some ways. I knew a lot of the terms, but it was, and I had sort of this vague, sort of sepia-toned idea of what Judaism looked like at the turn of the century, very Fiddler on the Roof-esque sort of. And it was completely different than that. There were so many different permutations of Judaism and so many different, everything from atheism to Hasidism. Everything that we have today was back then too. And that came as a surprise, but really shouldn't have. As to sort of the other sort of cultural side of it and Syrian stuff, the big discovery that I made very early in the research was that the Syrians who came to the U.S. at the turn of the century were Christian, not Muslim. And my husband's family, his father's family, is Muslim from Syria. So I didn't learn as much about his culture as I learned just about the general history of the country, and sort of Syria then being Greater Syria, and Lebanon being part of that, and all of that being ruled by the Ottoman Empire, and all that sort of all the various tensions that were going on at the time, and the poverty really in the Mount Lebanon area that was sending so many people to America, basically to just make anything that they could to send back home. So that was a very big education, because I knew nothing, absolutely nothing about any of that stuff.
Did it bring you closer to him somehow to research that?
Probably closer to his dad. His dad is one of these guys who you ask a question and you'll be sitting there for the next 3 hours as he tells you the history of the subject from basically Mesopotamia up. And so I would talk to him about some of the stuff that I was researching, and he would give me sort of the background information on it, and it was all completely overwhelming, but he was a great resource to have. And did it bring me closer to my husband? Oh gosh, what a question.
I'm sorry, I know I feel like we're at a cocktail party.
Cocktail party with no cocktails.
I got to tell him stuff, and he got to read things, and he got to know a little bit more about just telling him the research, and he got to know what I was working on, and I think that sort of that process of telling him, and he became a really good reader of the book, and gave me advice and points and stuff. And I don't know if you and your husband, if he reads your stuff and whatever, but
No,
it was
he's under instructions to read it and say, you are a genius.
wonderful you are.
I don't know why I make you do laundry,
Yep.
but you should only.
No, and there were times when I gave him chapters and said, read these and tell me how awesome they are. But then he would give me some stuff that, maybe I wouldn't want to hear, and I'd be fuming over it, like, while I did the dishes or whatever. But then, 2 days or later, it's like, gosh, darn it, he was right. So, yeah. Which it sucks, because it's like, I can't tell him about what to do on an experiment, It's like, no, you gotta set the detector the other way.
But probably if you did have, I don't know, it's sort of like, honey, do I look fat in this? They know they shouldn't, but if you really look really fat in it,
Yeah.
they should say something. So like, if he says something at all,
Yes.
I know it must be really
Yes.
important.
And I know the audience is dying to tell you how awesome you are, and it's actually that time of the evening to turn it over to audience Q&A.
Oh, right.
Was that an okay transition?
Excellent.
So here's what's going to happen. We have some time for Q&A, and we have some people in the back who will bring mics around. So please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and don't start your question until you have the microphone.
Hi, my question's for Andrew. I'm a New Yorker and I just moved here, and I wanted to know, how deep did you have to go into the research about the downtown scene, because it was fairly accurate, the way you described everything, because I remember being a kid when I was first moved there, and it was pretty spot on.
You mean the 1985, like when AIDS was sort of everywhere? Because there's not that much in it in the book, but that one I talked to people. That one, I felt like the best stuff I got wasn't what the news was reporting. I talked to friends in New York, but also, weirdly, I used the history section of the San Francisco Library. They have the Randy Shields collection, where they have these binders of the first AIDS clinic in 1981 that Dianne Feinstein set up here, and they have the first couple patients and Polaroid pictures of them, and then next is a thank you letter that says, thank you, all better now. And then there's an obituary. And you're getting the thank you letters, and slowly you're seeing the obituaries, and the pages start filling up, and they're just trying to write down a description of these men who they know don't have families and who will disappear from history, and they're writing down what they look like. And there was one I remember that just said, Kevin was the sweetest. And I could cry again seeing it. I couldn't finish going through the binder, but, and I talked with people who talked about the West Village and said that there would be signs that said, gone home. And that you would say that about men. You would say, oh, he's gone home, which means he died. But you couldn't say that. And that's where it was just people's reports at that time. And there's people in this audience who remember San Francisco at that time. And what all I remember was, which wasn't in the book, I remember reading the obituaries for pneumonia. You know.
The French teacher at high school died of pneumonia. Yeah, we all know.
How did you know?
Because that was how he read was getting.
Yeah. So it's weird. It's a period that I feel like is remembered by us, but I couldn't read about it, you know, and particularly in mostly when I do research, I read newspapers of the era because I like to see what a Times fantasy of itself is in the moment. But reading the New York Times was very technical and difficult for me to capture what it felt like. I could read The Voice though; that was available.
Hi, this question is for Helene. I'm really interested in the character of the ice cream vendor in your, and how did you, because there's the, sort of the magical qualities of, you added that in besides just the genie and the golem, and what made you do that, and how did that character evolve?
You know, it's really funny. The character she's referring to is sort of the one Muslim character in the book. He's named Ice Cream Saleh, and he's an ice cream vendor who has a very troubled history, troubled past. And he is sort of the one character in the book who was a complete surprise to me and who arrived basically fully formed. Everyone else I sort of had to, you know, drag kicking and screaming and sort of mold them very, you know, carefully and you know, change their characters over and over. But I was doing some research, actually, talking about research. I was looking in the archives of Columbia at one of the New York newspapers that doesn't exist anymore, but had an article around, you know, 1895 about this picturesque new neighborhood that was, you know, of Little Syria. It was very, very condescending and oh, look at these interesting foreigners sort of stuff. And it had illustrations, and there was this one illustration of a man sitting on the sidewalk holding an ice cream tray with a turban, a white turban wrapped around his head. And he had just the saddest eyes, and the caption was, "An ice cream seller." And I looked at that guy and I was like, who is that? And almost instantly, he just, like his whole story just sort of appeared to me. And I went and I like sat at the computer and just typed out his whole backstory, and it survived pretty much intact from then just to when he appears in the book, and there's that like 4 pages of his history. It didn't get changed that much, and so. But he was like the one character that did that. And then I had to figure out what he was going to do now that he was in the book. And that was early enough in the writing process that I could have a character just sort of appear from nowhere and be able to work him into the book. So yeah, so he was a real gift, and I grew very attached to him.
There was a question in the back, and we missed you earlier.
Yes, a question for the lady and the gentleman. In terms, can you talk a little bit about the interaction between the narrative writing and the research? You, for example, you write something, I don't know what, I missed a historical fact, or do you do the research, then write and get stuck, or how does it work for you?
Well, I bet it's going to be similar, because she just said something that makes sense, which is you read tons and tons and tons of research, and really it's when something strikes you and you don't know why, that suddenly something lights up and you're like, okay, I'll pick that one, like that one picture in particular. Because what we're looking for is not necessarily like the general way of things, like the way things happened on average, but the very specific things that happen to specific people. So unless you're writing a history book, we're more interested in stuff left on the ground, you know, and the people you walk by, the things that are sort of not the way you naturally, so it comes alive.
Exactly, and that sort of like the telling detail and the, you know, especially when you're faced with so much, like you know, just New York. Everything has been written down in New York for hundreds of years, and so you could spend your entire life researching, but it's sort of looking for the nuggets and looking for the interesting stuff that's going to set the stage, or just sort of that you realize, oh, that is what my character has to trip over in order for this thing to happen. But this interesting thing would happen with me in research, where I would research myself out of ideas, because, you know, and I'm not going to be able to think of, unfortunately, any specific ones right now, but, you know, just like, oh, what if, like, you know, someone goes to this neighborhood and has this sort of experience, and then doing the research and realizing, oh, well, that wouldn't happen because of whatever was going on at the time. That thing that I was remembering wasn't actually there back at 1900 or whatever. Or, you know, Central Park, so many of the structures in Central Park, like, they were built, they, you know, fell down, they got changed, whatever, and so I'd research and go, drat, but then something else that I would find would spur another idea. So it was sort of like this blessing and a curse thing, but probably more of a blessing, because I got so many ideas just from the research.
Well, and you can tell when, it's fun when they connect to a plot idea of something, you know, like, that just feels so amazing. I did all the research about the Lower East Side, almost none of it made it into the book, but she goes and watches a movie, and she seems to have this lover in this alternate life who's an actor, and she goes to a movie in 1918, and when I found out that they would have these movie theaters and they would have actors read aloud the cards for the silent movies because the audience could read, I was like, that tells me everything about that part of New York and that moment in time more than all the other great stuff I found, you know.
And the bit about the gondolas that carried the money back.
Oh, you're so good. Yeah, they had gondolas in Bloomingdale's because they didn't trust the sales girls to be able to be smart enough to make change. So they would put the money into it, it would go back to the cashier's box, and it would come back with the change. Although it's not like I can make change, I use the computer in the register, right?
I'd like to go back to the question of the magical, and there are different kinds of magic. One, of course, is the act of writing itself, since you're conjuring a world different from the one in which you live. But there's the magic of the subjective magic of the mind, the projections of the mind. That see magic all around us, or that creating. There's also, in fiction at least, a more objectified magic in which we believe in the separate existence of magical characters as distinct from those characters being projections of the minds, or the mind of, let's say, a first-person narrator or a point-of-view character. And then there's also, of course, the magic of history. Because the moment we enter history, we're in a world that has become magical because it no longer exists. And I wondered if you'd talk a little bit about the ways in which these different kinds of magic blend in what you wrote.
Well, it seems clear for both of us that it's the same. The imaginative process and the what-if process, and getting to dip yourself into history. You know that, like, we've got it wrong, which is freeing, because you get to pick up whatever you like of it to bring back up. with your story.
And I don't know if this goes to your question, but for me, what became sort of the necessary thing to do was really locking in that suspension of disbelief in order to preserve that magic. And for me, that meant defining the rules up front and making New York so as real as I could, so that all the magic didn't come from, well, you know, New York, of course, having its own magic, but sort of the functional magic in the book coming straight from these two characters and only from them and how they interact with everyone else, so that it just makes it easier for the reader, that they can trust that whatever happens is not going to pull them out and of the story and say, well, wait a minute, then why didn't he, or, you know, but he couldn't do that 6 pages ago. And that, because that to me is sort of like the worst thing you can do as a writer is just to sort of destroy that trust with the reader. So that was sort of how I decided I was going to go about sort of building and preserving that magic.
And to get into it early on,
Yeah.
you know, to go, I actually had such trouble getting the magical part to happen in this book that I had to consult a bunch of friends. One was Karen Joy Fowler, who wrote Jane Austen Book Club. She's written a lot of science fiction too. And she said, well, Andy, what you have to do is, all right, you want your character to wake up and suddenly he's on Mars. What you do is he wakes up, he says, why are there, what does Mars have, 2 moons? 2 moons. But there's like a Martian comes in the window with a sword and he has to battle the Martian and he never thinks about it again, right? It's like Alice, she's like, where was that hole? Oh, why am I down here? Oh, look at that little garden through the door. I want to go in there. She doesn't think about it again why this is happening, which is just what you did. I mean, like, just go with it,
Yep.
which is really scary.
Yep. Yeah. And do it straight up at the beginning and just drag the reader with you.
But the way you do is if you're like, it's New York in the 19th, you know, like, it's every part of it is you have to believe that the author has a firm control over the story, the narrator does, and is going to take you along. Like, it doesn't matter how magical it is, it's the same thing of just the story of divorce. You have to believe it's a story worth telling. And that's the same job for anyone. That's just storytelling.
We have time for one more question. Anybody else?
Speaking of scary, did both of you, like all writers that I know, I think, have difficulty finding your ending? Or did you know all along how it was going to end? I haven't read the stories, but most people I know think that's hard.
Well, first I would like to say that the way it works is that we have a fever dream and we put it on the page and it doesn't change. And it's what we, as a gift we have, we give to you. Or at least that's what we want it to seem like when you open the book. So it was no trouble at all. You're welcome.
Mine arrived in a little gondola for the guy.
Oh. I will say, I don't have trouble with endings, I have trouble with beginnings. Because I write the first 50, 100 pages, it takes like a year to do that. And then by the time I get to the end, I've worked out I've already had the nervous breakdown. So I'm fine. But that is not my particular problem.
I had a terrible time with
I'm
that.
so sorry to hear that.
You have the advantage of having written more than one book, so I don't know if this is going to be, the start, if this is the start of a trend or what, but yeah, the first ending I wrote absolutely sucked. And I knew it, and I had to write it to get through it. I was on deadline to HarperCollins. I was over deadline, actually. I was 3 months after giving birth, And it was just this horrible, horrible experience of typing and everything, just being, this sucks, this sucks, this sucks, this sucks, this sucks. But it was the ending that I had planned for years. Sent it off, finished it finally, sent it off to my agent and my editor and said, okay, this is terrible, let's talk about it. And they said it in nicer terms than that, but agreed. And we sort of went back to the drawing board, and I realized that what had happened was so much had accumulated in the book over this 7-year process of writing it, that it was like all the loose ends, all the chickens were coming home to roost, and I had to sort of account for all of this falderall that it had, you know, just magical amulets and books and characters who didn't really need to be there, and it was like I was figuring out a chess endgame instead of writing an emotionally satisfying ending. And so we went back and streamlined the book and tossed a bunch of stuff out, and then I could write the ending that really made sense and really fit the book. And I don't recommend doing it that way. I don't actually remember much of that process. I was on about 4 hours of sleep per night, and just terrified. And you know, we had to like fly my mom out to take care of the baby because I just needed to be writing 24 hours a day. It was just so anyway. That's.
It is so good to hear of other people suffering. That is much worse. Mine was bad, but that sounds a lot worse.
I hope it doesn't happen again, but I got through it. So if that's the way it needs to happen again, that's the way it needs to happen.
I just think with the book, and yours is, look how much bigger hers is than mine.
It was about that much bigger too.
Wow.
Yeah.
Both books can be yours. Because we are now out of time for questions. I want to thank Andrew Sean Greer and Helene Wecker for reading, for answering our questions.